"Get on the ground." That vehicle was reported stolen. The shout cut through the warm morning air like a crack of thunder, instantly turning dozens of heads toward the federal courthouse plaza. Conversation stopped. Footsteps slowed. Even the pigeons gathered near the stone fountain seemed to scatter as Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped forward with firm authority in his voice. At the center of the attention stood a black man beside a black Mercedes-Benz S-Class, its polished surface reflecting the bright Washington sunlight. For a moment, nobody moved. The man simply looked up from the driver's side door, one hand still resting near the handle, his expression calm enough to feel almost out of place amid the growing tension. Around him, people began reaching for their phones. Some whispered. Others stared openly. In a city where power wore expensive suits and traveled behind tinted windows, public accusations always attracted a crowd. Ryan felt the familiar rush that came whenever instinct told him he was close to solving a case. Less than 2 hours earlier, Dispatch had circulated an alert regarding a luxury sedan matching this exact model and color. The details had burned themselves into his memory. Black Mercedes. Government district. Possible stolen vehicle. Now here it was, parked less than 100 yards from one of the most important courthouses in the country. The timing felt too perfect to ignore. "Sir, step away from the car and keep your hands where I can see them," Ryan called again. The man complied immediately. No argument. No sudden movement. Just a slow step backward and a quiet nod. Yet somehow that calmness irritated Ryan more than resistance would have. He had seen confidence before. Sometimes it came from people who believed they were smarter than everyone else. Sometimes it came from people who thought they could talk their way out of trouble. The growing crowd seemed to reach the same conclusion. "Looks like they finally caught him," someone muttered nearby. Another voice answered, "About time." The comments spread through the gathering spectators like wind through dry leaves. The black man glanced briefly toward the courthouse steps rising above the plaza. Massive white columns stretched toward a cloudless sky. American flags fluttered gently overhead. Then he looked back at Ryan. "Officer," he said in an even voice, "there appears to be a misunderstanding." Ryan barely reacted. He had heard those exact words countless times. The man reached slowly into the inside pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. Several people gasped. Ryan immediately raised his hand. "Stop right there." The man froze without complaint. Sunlight glinted across the courthouse windows. The marble beneath everyone's feet seemed to radiate heat. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the hour. Yet the center of the plaza felt suspended in time. Every eye remained fixed on the scene unfolding beside the luxury sedan. Nobody noticed the black SUVs turning onto the avenue several blocks away. Nobody noticed the convoy moving steadily toward the courthouse. And nobody in that growing crowd had the slightest idea that the man being publicly accused at that very moment was one of the most powerful legal minds in the United States. The man slowly lowered his hand from the inside pocket of his jacket and remained exactly where he stood. There was no fear in his face, no anger either. If anything, there was a quiet patience that seemed strangely out of place amid the growing tension. Officer Ryan Mitchell noticed it immediately. Most people became nervous when a crowd gathered around them. Most people raised their voices when accused of something they did not do. This man did neither. He simply stood beneath the bright morning sun, his polished black shoes resting on the pale courthouse stone as if he had all the time in the world. A warm breeze drifted across the plaza, carrying the distant scent of coffee from a street vendor half a block away. The American flags above the courthouse entrance moved gently against a cloudless blue sky. Yet the atmosphere below felt heavy. The crowd had nearly doubled in size. Office workers paused on their way to nearby buildings. Tourists stopped to watch. Several people continued recording with their phones. The man glanced briefly toward the courthouse doors. For a moment, something softened in his eyes. He had walked through entrances like these for decades. Not as a visitor, not as a tourist, as a man who had dedicated his life to the law. Justice Elijah Carter had been born more than 600 miles south of Washington in a small Alabama town where opportunities often arrived slowly and left quickly. His father worked long shifts cleaning office buildings. His mother taught elementary school children how to read. Neither had wealth. Neither had influence. What they possessed instead was discipline. Every evening, after exhausting workdays, they sat with their son at a worn kitchen table, and reminded him that education could open doors no one else could unlock. Elijah listened. He studied harder than anyone around him. Scholarships followed, then law school, then years spent fighting cases that many people considered unwinnable. Eventually, his name became known in courtrooms across the country. His opinions were quoted in law schools. His decisions shaped legal history. Yet despite everything he had achieved, he still disliked unnecessary attention. That was why there were no flashing lights announcing his arrival today. No security detail walking beside him. No assistants carrying briefcases. He preferred arriving alone whenever possible. The courthouse before him was hosting a ceremony honoring newly appointed federal judges. Elijah had accepted an invitation months earlier. Several young judges would take their oath that morning. He remembered standing in their position many years ago. Nervous, hopeful, determined. He wanted to be there for them. Ryan, however, knew none of this. Standing 20 feet away, he saw only a luxury sedan, a suspicious coincidence, and a man who seemed unusually calm under pressure. His instincts continued whispering that something was wrong. Dispatch had warned officers to remain alert. The stolen vehicle report remained active. Every detail appeared to fit. Ryan folded his arms and watched closely. "Sir," he said, his tone firm but controlled, "I am going to need identification." Elijah nodded slowly. "Of course, officer." His voice remained steady, respectful, the kind of voice that carried authority without demanding it. Around them, the courthouse clock struck 9. The sound echoed across the stone plaza. Somewhere beyond the crowd, engines quietly approached the federal complex. But neither Ryan nor the spectators paid attention. Their focus remained entirely on the man beside the black Mercedes, unaware that within minutes the entire story was about to change. Officer Ryan Mitchell extended his hand, waiting. The crowd leaned closer. Phones remained raised. Somewhere a camera shutter clicked repeatedly. Justice Elijah Carter reached slowly into his jacket and removed a slim leather wallet. His movements were deliberate, careful, almost ceremonial. He opened it and presented his identification without a trace of frustration. Ryan took the card and glanced down. The name meant nothing to him at first. His attention immediately shifted to something else. The address: Washington, District of Columbia. The age: the profession listed on an accompanying credential. Ryan narrowed his eyes. It did not fit the image he had already built in his mind. Before he could study it further, his radio crackled to life. The voice from dispatch sounded distant beneath layers of static. Another officer was requesting information about the vehicle report. Ryan pressed the transmit button and stepped a few feet away while still keeping Elijah in view. "Confirm details on the stolen Mercedes," he said. "I have a possible match." The response came several seconds later. "Vehicle entered into the system this morning. Black Mercedes S-Class. Last seen near Arlington. Owner currently unavailable for contact." Ryan looked back toward the luxury sedan. Every detail seemed to reinforce his suspicion. The color matched. The model matched. Even the timing matched. The coincidence felt too large to ignore. Around him, spectators exchanged theories. Some believed the situation would be resolved within minutes. Others were already convinced they were witnessing the arrest of a sophisticated criminal. Elijah could hear fragments of their conversations drifting through the warm air. He remained silent. Experience had taught him that people often preferred assumptions over facts. The courthouse steps rose behind him like a wall of white stone and history. He had argued before judges in buildings larger than this one. He had written opinions that filled textbooks. He had spent years teaching young attorneys that patience could be more powerful than anger. Now he found himself practicing that lesson once again. Ryan returned and studied the identification more carefully. Something about the credentials seemed unusually prestigious, but he could not place it. "What brings you here today, sir?" he asked. Elijah answered honestly. "I am attending a judicial ceremony." A few people in the crowd laughed softly. One man shook his head. Another whispered, "That is a good one." Ryan felt his skepticism grow. The answer sounded convenient, almost rehearsed. "A judicial ceremony?" he repeated. Elijah nodded. "Yes." "And you expect me to believe that?" Ryan asked. Elijah did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the massive bronze courthouse doors. They remained closed for the moment. Officials and invited guests had not yet begun entering. Sunlight reflected from the windows above, casting bright patterns across the stone plaza. "Officer," Elijah said calmly, "I do not need you to believe me. I only need you to verify the facts." The statement lingered in the air. Ryan frowned. Most people tried to persuade. Most people became defensive. This man simply waited. The confidence unsettled him. Yet before he could ask another question, the low hum of approaching engines rolled across the avenue. Several heads turned. Black SUVs were moving steadily toward the courthouse entrance, their polished surfaces gleaming beneath the morning sun. Whatever routine encounter Ryan thought he was handling was beginning to feel far less routine than before. The black SUVs rolled smoothly to the curb in front of the courthouse, their engines humming quietly before falling silent. For a brief moment, the crowd shifted its attention away from Elijah Carter and toward the arriving vehicles. Men and women in business attire stepped aside to clear a path. A few spectators lowered their phones, assuming some government official had arrived for the ceremony. Officer Ryan Mitchell glanced toward the convoy and then back at Elijah. The timing bothered him. Something about the man's calm confidence and the sudden arrival of high-level visitors refused to fit together. Still, he pushed the thought aside. Facts mattered more than feelings. At least that was what he told himself. "I am still waiting for verification," Ryan said. Elijah nodded politely. "And I am still willing to wait." The answer somehow made Ryan more uncomfortable than an argument would have. Nearby, two courthouse employees emerged from the front entrance carrying folders and event programs. They slowed when they noticed the gathering crowd. One whispered something to the other. Both stared toward Elijah before quickly looking away. Ryan caught the exchange. His suspicion sharpened. If the man truly belonged here, why did nobody step forward to identify him? The question settled heavily in his mind. The courthouse clock continued ticking toward the start of the ceremony. Guests were beginning to arrive from every direction. Federal attorneys, law clerks, judges from neighboring districts. Most avoided the growing crowd, but many slowed enough to observe the unusual scene unfolding near the plaza fountain. Elijah could feel their eyes. He recognized some faces. Former colleagues. Former students. A few people appeared to recognize him as well, yet none approached immediately. They seemed confused by what they were seeing. One elderly woman paused at the bottom of the courthouse steps. Her expression changed the moment she noticed Elijah standing beside the Mercedes. She looked from him to Ryan and then back again. For a second it seemed she might intervene. Instead, she continued toward the entrance, clearly uncertain about what was happening. Ryan folded his arms. "You seem remarkably comfortable for someone under investigation." Elijah offered a faint smile. "Comfort comes from knowing the truth." Several people nearby exchanged glances. The statement spread through the crowd in whispers. Ryan felt the pressure building around him. Too many spectators. Too many cameras. Too much attention. If he backed away now and the vehicle truly was stolen, he would look careless. If he pushed forward and turned out to be wrong, the consequences could be equally embarrassing. The uncertainty frustrated him. Dispatch finally responded again through his radio. Ryan immediately lifted it to his ear. The voice on the other end sounded rushed. There had been an update regarding the original report. Ryan listened carefully as details crackled through the speaker. His expression tightened. The information was incomplete. The registered owner had finally been contacted, but additional confirmation was still pending. Before Ryan could ask another question, one of the rear doors on the lead SUV opened. A tall man in a dark suit stepped onto the sidewalk and scanned the plaza. The crowd instinctively moved aside. Then the man's eyes landed on Elijah Carter. Instantly, his expression changed. He began walking directly toward him. The suited man moved through the crowd with purpose, his polished shoes striking the courthouse stone in quick, measured steps. Conversations faded around him. Several people instinctively stepped aside. Officer Ryan Mitchell watched carefully, expecting the newcomer to approach courthouse officials or members of the arriving delegation. Instead, the man headed directly toward Elijah Carter. That single detail sent an uncomfortable feeling through Ryan's chest. The stranger stopped a few feet away and looked first at Elijah, then at Ryan. His expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Sir," he said respectfully to Elijah, "we have been looking for you." A murmur spread through the crowd. Ryan immediately stepped forward. "Do you know this man?" The stranger turned toward him. "Of course I know him." The answer came so quickly that Ryan barely had time to react. "And you are?" Ryan asked. The man reached inside his jacket and presented federal credentials. The seal caught the sunlight. Several nearby spectators leaned closer. Ryan examined the identification and felt his confidence falter for the first time that morning. The man was not a driver, not an assistant, not a family member. He was a senior official attached to the federal judiciary. Before Ryan could process that information, two more members of the delegation approached from the SUVs. Both appeared equally concerned. One of them looked directly at Elijah. "Sir, the ceremony begins in less than 20 minutes. The plaza grew quieter. Even the people recording with their phones seemed uncertain what they were witnessing. Ryan glanced from one official to another. None of them looked surprised to see Elijah. They looked surprised only by the situation surrounding him. The officer's radio crackled again. This time the dispatcher's voice sounded urgent. "Ryan, update on the vehicle report." He pressed the radio closer. "Go ahead." The original report was entered in error. "Repeat. The report appears to involve a different vehicle with a matching description. Registration records confirm the Mercedes at your location belongs to its lawful owner." Ryan felt the blood drain from his face. Around him, the crowd remained unaware of what dispatch had just said. They could only see his expression changing. The certainty that had carried him through the morning was suddenly disappearing. He looked toward the luxury sedan, then toward Elijah, then back toward the federal officials standing beside him. A cold realization began forming in his mind. One of the officials frowned. "Officer, has there been some misunderstanding here?" Ryan opened his mouth, but no words came immediately. The courthouse bells echoed softly across the plaza. Above them, the flags continued moving in the breeze. The entire scene seemed to slow. Elijah remained composed. He had not raised his voice once. He had not demanded special treatment. He had not reminded anyone of his achievements or status. He simply stood there in silence while the truth gradually surfaced around him. Several courthouse employees now gathered near the entrance. More than a few recognized Elijah. Their expressions mirrored the same disbelief spreading through the crowd. People who had whispered assumptions only minutes earlier now exchanged nervous glances. The atmosphere had changed completely. Ryan understood that something much larger than a mistaken vehicle report was unfolding. Yet he still did not know the full truth. He only knew that the man he had questioned all morning was clearly someone important. And judging by the growing concern on every federal official's face, the answer was about to become impossible for anyone to ignore. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The noise of the city seemed to drift away beyond the courthouse walls, leaving only the sound of a distant fountain and the soft rustle of flags overhead. The tension that had filled the plaza all morning began changing into something else. Uncertainty. Officer Ryan Mitchell stood motionless, the radio still in his hand. The update from dispatch echoed in his mind. The vehicle was not stolen. The report had been wrong. Every conclusion he had built his actions upon was now crumbling beneath him. Around him, people who had once whispered accusations now avoided eye contact. Some slowly lowered their phones. Others looked at Elijah Carter with growing curiosity. The federal officials remained beside him, their concern obvious. Yet Elijah himself seemed untouched by the shifting atmosphere. He simply looked toward the courthouse entrance as sunlight reflected from the marble columns above. The warm glow settled across the stone plaza, softening the sharp edges of the morning. For a moment, Elijah was no longer focused on the crowd or the confusion surrounding him. His thoughts drifted elsewhere. He remembered being 12 years old, standing beside his father outside an office building in Montgomery. His father had just finished a night shift cleaning floors. The man had been exhausted, his work boots worn from years of labor. Yet he still found the energy to place a hand on his son's shoulder and offer advice. "Do not let other people decide who you are." Those words had stayed with Elijah through every chapter of his life. Through law school, through difficult courtrooms, through victories and disappointments alike. And now, standing before one of the most important courthouses in America, he heard them again. A gentle breeze moved through the plaza. The scent of fresh-cut grass drifted from a nearby park. Somewhere overhead, a bell chimed softly. The morning carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet for Ryan, everything had changed. He looked at Elijah and saw something he had missed before. Not status, not power, dignity. The older man had been questioned, doubted, and publicly scrutinized, yet he had never once responded with anger. He had never tried to humiliate anyone in return. That realization settled heavily in Ryan's chest. One of the federal officials checked his watch. Another glanced toward the courthouse doors, which were beginning to open for arriving guests. Small groups of judges and attorneys moved inside beneath the towering columns. Their conversations floated faintly across the plaza. The ceremony was about to begin. Still, no one left. It felt as though everyone instinctively understood they were standing at the edge of an important moment. Ryan swallowed hard. Questions filled his mind. Who exactly was Elijah Carter? Why were senior judiciary officials treating him with such respect? Why did every person who seemed to recognize him react with the same mixture of surprise and concern? The answers felt close now. Close enough to touch. The sunlight brightened across the courthouse steps. Shadows shortened across the stone. And in the quiet space between one breath and the next, the truth continued moving steadily toward the plaza, carrying with it a revelation that would leave the entire crowd speechless. The silence broke when a second vehicle door opened and an older man stepped onto the sidewalk. Unlike the others, he did not look around to assess the situation. He looked directly at Elijah Carter. The reaction was immediate. Every federal official standing nearby straightened their posture. Conversation stopped. A pair of courthouse employees froze halfway up the steps. The newcomer moved forward with calm confidence, his silver hair catching the sunlight as he approached. Officer Ryan Mitchell felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He recognized the man instantly from news broadcasts and legal publications. Chief Justice Robert Whitmore, one of the most recognizable figures in the American legal system. The crowd recognized him too. A ripple of surprise spread across the plaza. Phones rose once again, but this time for an entirely different reason. Chief Justice Whitmore reached Elijah and extended his hand. "Justice Carter," he said warmly. "We were wondering where you were." The world seemed to stop. Ryan blinked, then blinked again. The words echoed through his mind with crushing clarity. Justice Carter. Not Attorney Carter. Not Professor Carter. Justice Carter. Around the plaza, expressions shifted from curiosity to disbelief. Several spectators looked at one another as if they had misheard. One woman covered her mouth. Another lowered her phone entirely. Elijah accepted the handshake with a quiet smile. "I am afraid I was delayed," he replied. The Chief Justice glanced briefly toward Ryan and the gathering crowd. His expression darkened with concern. "Delayed," he repeated. One of the federal officials stepped forward and explained the situation in a careful voice. No exaggeration. No accusation. Just facts. A mistaken vehicle report. An investigation. A misunderstanding. As the explanation unfolded, the realization spread through the crowd like a wave. People who had watched the entire encounter suddenly understood who had been standing before them all morning. The man beside the black Mercedes was not simply attending the ceremony. He was one of the most respected judges in the nation, a member of the Supreme Court of the United States. Ryan felt the ground beneath him seem less stable. Every assumption he had made replayed in painful detail. The comments from the crowd, the skepticism, the questions, the certainty, all of it now looked completely different. Chief Justice Whitmore turned back toward Elijah. "The ceremony cannot begin without you," he said. "Half the judges inside are waiting to meet the man delivering the keynote address." A stunned murmur swept across the plaza. Keynote address. Supreme Court Justice. The words landed one after another. Ryan could barely breathe. He looked toward Elijah, expecting anger, disappointment, perhaps even outrage. Instead, he found only calm. The same calm that had been there from the beginning. The courthouse bells rang again above the plaza. Sunlight reflected from the marble columns. In that moment, every eye remained fixed on Elijah Carter. Not because of power, not because of status, but because the man who had every reason to demand respect had spent the entire morning quietly demonstrating it. And standing there beneath the towering courthouse steps, Officer Ryan Mitchell finally understood just how wrong he had been. No one moved for several seconds. The plaza remained suspended in stunned silence as the weight of the revelation settled over everyone present. The courthouse steps that had seemed so imposing earlier now felt like the backdrop to a lesson nobody had expected to receive. Officer Ryan Mitchell stood frozen, his face drained of confidence. The certainty that had guided him all morning had vanished completely. He looked toward Justice Elijah Carter and felt a growing sense of regret unlike anything he had experienced in his career. The federal officials began preparing to escort Elijah inside, but before anyone could move, Ryan stepped forward. The crowd watched carefully. Some expected an argument. Others expected a formal reprimand. Instead, Ryan removed his cap and held it respectfully at his side. "Justice Carter," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent plaza, "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air. They were simple, but they cost him more pride than anyone could see. "I made assumptions before I had all the facts. I was wrong." Several spectators lowered their eyes. A few looked uncomfortable, remembering their own comments from earlier. Elijah studied the officer for a moment. The morning sun reflected softly across the marble beneath their feet. The breeze continued moving the flags overhead. Everything felt strangely calm now. "Officer Mitchell," Elijah replied. "Every person makes mistakes." Ryan swallowed hard. "That does not excuse mine." Elijah nodded slightly. "No, it does not." The honesty of the response seemed to surprise everyone. Yet there was no anger in his voice. Only truth. Ryan looked down briefly before meeting Elijah's eyes again. "I am sorry for how I handled this." The plaza remained silent. Then something unexpected happened. Elijah smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. Not the smile of someone who had won. It was the smile of someone who understood the difference between punishment and growth. "The law teaches many lessons," he said. "But one of the most important is that character is revealed by what we do after discovering we were wrong." Ryan listened carefully. So did everyone else. "You had an opportunity today," Elijah continued. "Most people spend years believing they are completely fair without ever examining themselves. Today forced you to ask difficult questions. That is not failure. That is the beginning of wisdom." The words struck the crowd with surprising force. Nobody expected compassion. Nobody expected grace. Chief Justice Whitmore watched quietly from nearby, his expression softening. Ryan looked genuinely overwhelmed. "I do not know how to make this right," he admitted. Elijah glanced toward the courthouse entrance where young judges were gathering inside for the ceremony. Then he looked back at Ryan. "Learn from it," he said. "The next person you meet may not have a title anyone recognizes. They may not arrive in a luxury car. They may never have powerful people standing beside them. Treat them with the same dignity anyway." Ryan nodded slowly. The lesson landed deeper than any public criticism ever could. Around them, people who had arrived expecting a scandal found themselves witnessing something far more powerful. Not revenge, not humiliation, redemption. And as Justice Elijah Carter finally turned toward the courthouse steps, the entire atmosphere seemed lighter, as though the morning itself had been transformed by the choice to answer misunderstanding with grace. Justice Elijah Carter began walking toward the courthouse entrance, his pace unhurried, his posture relaxed. The crowd parted naturally as he passed. No one spoke. No one called out. The same people who had spent the morning watching, judging, and speculating now stood quietly beneath the bright Washington sky. Sunlight poured across the marble steps, turning them almost silver. The federal officials followed several paces behind, but Elijah walked alone. That was how he preferred it. As he climbed the first step, he paused briefly and looked toward the plaza one final time. Officer Ryan Mitchell remained where he stood. The younger man was no longer thinking about reports, procedures, or mistakes. He was thinking about a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Elijah offered a small nod. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. Just a simple acknowledgement between two men who had shared an unexpected moment. Ryan returned the nod. Then Elijah turned and continued upward. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was entirely different. Judges, attorneys, and invited guests filled the grand hall beneath towering ceilings and polished stone arches. Conversations softened the moment Elijah entered. People smiled. Some extended their hands. Others simply greeted him with quiet respect. Yet what stood out most was not how important he seemed. It was how warmly he treated everyone around him. A young law clerk holding a stack of folders nearly dropped them while stepping aside. Elijah stopped long enough to help steady the pile. An elderly guest struggled with a heavy door. Elijah held it open. The same dignity he had spoken about outside followed him into every interaction. Hours later, after the ceremony concluded, the courthouse began to empty. The afternoon sun hung low above the city, casting long golden shadows across the plaza. The crowds were gone now. The excitement had faded. Only a few employees remained near the entrance. Ryan found himself standing in the same spot where the morning had begun. The events replayed in his mind again and again. Then the courthouse doors opened. Elijah emerged alone. His keynote address had received a standing ovation. His schedule was full. Important people were waiting for him elsewhere. Yet he stopped when he saw Ryan. For a moment, neither man spoke. The city moved quietly around them. A distant siren echoed somewhere beyond the federal district. Leaves drifted across the sidewalk in the gentle breeze. Finally, Elijah extended his hand. Ryan looked surprised, then accepted it. The handshake lasted only a second, but its meaning stayed far longer. "Take care of yourself, officer," Elijah said. "And remember what we talked about." Ryan nodded. "I will, sir." Elijah smiled. Then he walked toward the black Mercedes waiting at the curb. The vehicle pulled away slowly, disappearing into the late afternoon traffic. Ryan remained standing on the courthouse steps long after it was gone. Above him, the American flag moved softly against the fading sky. Around him, the marble walls reflected the last light of day. And in the growing silence, he realized that the most powerful person he had met that morning was not powerful because of a title, a courtroom, or a seat on the highest bench in the nation. He was powerful because when given every opportunity to demand respect, he chose instead to teach it.